Good day, everyone. So yesterday I put out part 1 of Everything Australia, and boy, did it have a lot of information in it. Part 1 was very eye-opening, even though the information was coming at me very fast. I did get a pretty good overview of like the founding of Australia and what happened and everything. As I said, it's a pretty good base from which to take on, more detailed history of Australia. So let's go ahead and let's get into part 2.
This is the least interesting of the colonies, and there's not enough room for it here.
Oh. Wait, what?
Settled and occupied at a not altogether comfortable pace due to the French threat, Van Diemen's Land was the first bonus territory, where agriculture was just as difficult, if not worse than, the mainland. The colonial government came up with the unique decision among colonies to arm the convicts, who, while tasked with hunting kangaroos to feed the colony, kept expanding their grounds and coming into contact and conflict with Tasmanian Aboriginals, and often absconded to become the first Bushmen. Their violence and their diseases became in less than a century the cause of the only complete genocide of the British colonies. The colonial government's attempts to prevent their eventual demise involved keeping them like animals. The criminal proliferation would become a common refrain on the island's history, which would come to be known as the Stain. The south coast of the Stain was settled first because of its vital trade routes, and then the north coast was chosen because of vital trade routes. The land gave nothing, and the Van Diemen's Land economy was driven by whaling and sealing. Pasture was made by logging forest, which was neither highly paid nor popular among people with the
Oh my gosh, can you imagine trying to chop down that tree with axes? My goodness, those look almost as big as some of the redwoods we have over here in California.
Sealing. Pasture was made by logging forest, which was neither highly paid nor popular among people with the choice of other places to be. When the demand for kangaroo meat subsided, bushrangers instead predated on civilians. Colonial government became more and more brutal in its flushing out of the Stain, and anyone found harbouring the Stain could be sentenced for punishment themselves. People were often falsely accused, and a small guerrilla war against Hobart, the capital, dragged on. Van Diemen's Land took in 40% of all convicts transported to Australia, but the decline and absence in free settlers for them to work for meant that there were as many as 15,000 unemployed convicts milling around by 1835. The only thing of note Van Diemen's Land accomplished was its location between Sydney and civilization. Also because of the French, the land between Sydney and Hobart was explored, and a few convicts were planted there as soon as the Bass Strait was discovered to govern the Port Phillip district of New South Wales. It was a vital port, a rare example of shelter in such rough water that would come to claim the wrecks of around 1,000 ships and one Prime Minister. But the first people being sent included 2 drummers, but no fishermen and farmers. It was soon predictably abandoned in 4 months. 3 decades later, John Batman, a true blue Aussie-born billionaire superhero, set out to leave the hellhole of Van Diemen's Land. Vandemonian shepherds and graziers were coming up at the limits of what the island could produce, and this southern area of New South Wales was perfect for their needs. In a time...
Wait a second, so did Tasmania used to be called Van Diemen's Land? Is that what are you saying here? The explanation went so fast that I didn't really catch exactly what happened, so... Sounds like that may have been like the original name of it, and then it got changed to Tasmania at some point.
In a time when British and the colonial governments did not talk to Aboriginal people about the rights and ownership of the use of the land, Batman negotiated with the local Wurundjeri tribal leaders and paid for the land around the mouth of the Yarra River. However, far from being woke, he did this because he had previously been turned down by New South Wales for a grant, but Batman already saw squatters around the area, so he said screw that and found a new authority in the tribal leaders of the Wurundjeri, called confusingly Jagga Jagga, Jagga Jagga and Jagga Jagga. The Colonial Office came to declare this treaty null and void, as there was no way an Aboriginal could consent to a contract. Nevertheless, the settlement would come to be known as Batmania. Just kidding, it's Melbourne. From then, despite official protestations, Vandemonians rolled in, keen to escape the Stain. Even some New South Walians moseyed on south with their flocks. The colonial government tried its best to flush squatters from the land, but to no avail. So in true bureaucratic fashion, taking note from South Australia, land reform was the solution. An amnesty programme was introduced, whereby Crown land would be leased. In 1850, Port Phillip was proclaimed by Queen Victoria as a separate colony from New South Wales, with only a little bit of sucking up by naming it Victoria. The following year, a whole lot would change. The discovery
Oh,
couldn't be
okay.
kept secret for long. Down in Victoria, the gold rush would impact society more than any place on earth. Pounds of the stuff literally lay in the ground, and it didn't take any skill to find. A few years' salary, or sometimes a lifetime's fortune, could be made with just a shovel. Cities emptied and almost every man of working age staked claim to a plot of land on which to prospect. Victoria had accepted a smattering of convicts before colonyhood, but now former convicts from Van Diemen's Land were flooding across. With conditional pardon, they were free to work in Australia anywhere they liked, without having to show credentials, and untold numbers were tumbling out of ships and onto the goldfields. Eventually the land around Bendigo and Ballarat became so crowded with bodies that each man could mine on a patch of land that barely amounted to a few square feet. A handful struck it rich, plenty struck it fine, and a lot didn't get a penny. To counter this, groups of men would cooperate in cooperatives to share profits, to mitigate losses, and to benefit miners more equitably, supporting more families. It wasn't only prospectors who opened up the frontier, it was everyone who followed. Merchants, tobacconists, launderers, postmen, police, bureaucrats, accountants, inns and breweries. The whole gamut of society followed the Golden Brick Road. And more than California, women ventured into the goldfields too. Whether with a pan or a pint, some women became powerful local figures. Unlike California, you didn't need to go around a whole continent to go from the capital to the goldfield. Melbourne's population exploded 500%. It went from a backwater to become the richest city in the world within a decade. Beautiful buildings, universities, libraries, art galleries, theatres, restaurants, pubs and dance halls, all of this made the continent a place not just a hellhole at the end of the world, but a place to come to live. But it wasn't without downsides. The stain was proliferating, in favelas on the edge of Melbourne and in the goldfields hidden among free men. The Australasian Anti-Transportation League was formed to lobby for the end of the stain, and it had a flag. The colonies tried to prevent the former convicts from coming to Australia, but their wants were in conflict with the royal pardon, and it was not possible without self-rule, without the ability to make choices for themselves.
So a couple of parallels here to the U.S. that I'm just noticing is one, the gold rush, because we had one of those too, which he mentioned here with California. Although it looks like he said it was much easier to get to where the gold was in Australia because you didn't have to traverse. I don't know. He implied you had to go all the way around South America to get to California, which, I mean, I guess you could do that. You know, but I feel like there were a lot of people that did go across just the land too. So again, probably another part of American history I need to go back and re-study again. Also, this is also really interesting. I didn't know the gold rush is what led to like Melbourne becoming a city and becoming civilized, and it looks like it really grew and became a great place to live. And also the stain that he's talking about here, the information went by so fast. The stain, I think, is referring to the transport of convicts there, right? Or convicts being, used as labor or something like that. So this is kind of like Australia's version of slavery in a way, although it's not the same thing, I understand. And maybe isn't as bad as, like American slavery, but it's a similar issue, it seems like, too. So this is really interesting to see some of these parallels in a way. It's different. It's very different, but still the same, sort of.
Soon it also became apparent to British authorities that it was quite expensive to send convicts to the other side of the planet. Sending them into a gold rush with potential to become gazillionaires became less preferable than piling them into penitentiaries at home. The pen is, after all, mightier than the ship. In order to repair this PR that was being caused by Vandemonians, nicknamed demons, the island colony was renamed Tasmania after their favourite cartoon character. The final convict to Tasmania was sent from Britain in 1852, just one...
Oh, you know what? I guess that's why it's called the Tasmanian Devil, right? Because Tasmania was originally the demon island. So Tasmanian Devil, is that why the cartoon is called that? I never knew, why they called it that before. I'm assuming that's what it's referring to. Maybe it's not.
1 year after Victoria struck gold. But that gold went from Britain in 1852, just 1 year after Victoria struck gold. But that gold didn't last forever. By the mid-50s, the alluvial gold in the surface was getting rarer. After that, more work and more equipment was needed to dig deeper. Puddling machines and deep lead mining increased the dangers and reduced the profits. Fortunes were no longer possible and subsiding was more difficult. Many became salaried workers for mining companies who could afford the investments. The ones that remained out on the goldfields faced more hardship, however. The authorities issued expensive mining licenses with huge penalties for non-possession, fines and even imprisonment. Australians began to resent the onerous imposition, a head tax, for which they received nothing in return. They lived in dirty tent cities. Roads were in an awful condition. Crime was rampant and worst of all, they had no say in it. There was no democracy. A scuffle, come skirmish, come full-blown rebellion in a suburb of Ballarat broke out between miners and British forces. Barricaded into a barricade, they raised what the colonial forces called the rebel flag, but what Australians called the Australian flag. They were besieged by the British, and within a day, rebellion was snuffed out. Dozens were killed, 100 were arrested, but it was not in vain. With this Eureka stockade, democracy was on its way to Australia. On the shepherding frontier, in the bush, in the mines, in the prisons and out on the field, the Australian had learned who he could rely on. Not on the British, but on his fellow man. Unions and cooperatives had existed in various forms, but in official capacities they were now only beginning. Throughout the 1850s, Australian colonies lobbied for and were granted self-government, independent for most purposes from Westminster. A physically closer legislative body meant residents of Sydney, Hobart, Brisbane, Adelaide and Melbourne could gather, protest and make their demands known to their lawmakers. Thanks to these vital early steps, Australia would be on the forefront of social change. Businesses and landowners were no longer the only important political force, because for too long they had been causing problems. Mining companies in a King Midas-style pursuit were going through acres of topsoil and the clay underneath, mixed with water, crushed quartz and laced with mercury, arsenic and cyanide. Mining clay mixture byproducts comprised a deathly sludge that blocked rivers, killed fish, poisoned livestock, and in the winter of 1859 flooded and buried the town of Epsom outside Bendigo 2 feet deep. Landmark pollution legislation would be enacted by the Victorian Parliament in Melbourne to compel businesses to prevent and capture pollution. It was small, but that was a start. Stonemasons, vital for the booming construction industry, made a strike for an 8-hour day. Men were granted universal suffrage. Propertied women in South Australia were granted the vote in 1860, some of the first in the world. Later, the Labour, without a U, party would be the first national Labour government in the world. The people democratically enfranchised, this land became theirs. But not everyone would be included. The news of gold didn't just remain in English-speaking colonies, it also reached Hong Kong, where boatloads of Chinese were ready to go. In a form of indentured labour that today we would call slavery, these Chinese were generally in a no better condition than convicts, but nevertheless they were attracted by the possibility of striking it rich. Tens of thousands of Chinese made it, quite unfortunately at the same time as the disappearing alluvial gold, the violence and the social strain. Chinese were subject to segregation into slums, higher mining fees and being targets of race riots. They were blamed for taking all of the gold and being the source of all societal problems, despite them being, by the mid-1860s, less than 10% of immigrants. Immigration was curtailed implicitly on the basis of race. A hostile environment was created and the Chinese were treated like cargo. This was really the beginning of what became known as the White Australia policy.
Huh, I didn't know any of this.
Although it was the
You know, because, like, I know the Chinese also came over into California for the gold rush, and I think they were instrumental in a lot of that, and then also, like, laying the railroad and stuff. I don't think that they were necessarily treated that great either, if I remember right, but I don't think that they were on the level of, I don't know. I feel like, I don't think they were on the level of slaves. I think they were treated a little bit better than that, but I'm not sure. Like, I don't really know enough about it, honestly. But it's interesting, though, that at the same time, basically, they were also making their way over to the U.S. for the gold rush over here. So apparently that was a thing for China that that they, I guess, pursued in various parts of the world. Didn't know that. And I didn't know about the, I guess, all of the racial segregation and stuff either against the Chinese in Australia. I didn't know the Chinese in Australia was a thing either.
Although it was the first part of Australia to be encountered by Europeans, the west end of the continent dragged behind the rest of it in many ways. It was undesirable. The Dutch, with 200 years head start, could not use it, and neither could the French. Similar to the east coast, there are hospitable zones in the south coast around Swan River, for which the colony was originally named. However, in stark contrast to the east coast, there are no great mountain ranges, there is no great inland river, little promise for colonial expansion, and little to offer to free settlers. All the rain falls on the coast, meaning less inland crops and less inland grazing, less ability to feed less mouths. A smaller population was therefore no surprise. It's the driest and most sparsely populated part of the driest and most sparsely populated continent. A necessity for forced convict labour remained for 15 years after the other colonies shed it. The last convict ship landed in Western Australia in 1868, only around the time they had started to explore. It was a fantasy to try and effectively govern a land so large. Thankfully...
You know, this looks a lot like what I would picture the Sahara in Africa. It looks like that, especially with some of these trees in the background that have kind of like that flat look to them. Yeah, they look very similar to what I picture Africa looking like. We have some areas in the US that sort of look like this, but I feel like these bushes here are a little different. But the grassland is very, I mean, we have a ton of that in the middle of the country.
No one of interest to them lived there. Pearling towns in the Kimberley and the Pilbara were forced to employ Chinese, Malays and Aboriginals. That was when they weren't being washed away by cyclones. And before white Australia. Western Australia was on the edge of a desert, one of the most isolated settlements on planet Earth, full to the brim with...
Do you guys get cyclones? Like hurricanes over there too? Like, I don't know. Obviously we get a lot of them here, and I know that Asia gets them, like Japan and some of the Asian countries, like I guess the Philippines and so forth. They get what you guys would call cyclones, what we would call hurricanes over here. I didn't think about Australia getting them though. For some reason, I feel like we don't hear about it over here, so maybe that's why. But he just implied that you do. So do you guys get hurricanes or cyclones in Australia hitting it a lot? And if so, is it in the western part of the country?
When they weren't being washed away by cyclones. And before white Australia. Western Australia was on the edge of a desert, one of the most isolated settlements on planet Earth, full to the brim with convicts and with little to look forward to. Self-government arrived here late. In technical terms, Western Australia was a shithole, until, counterintuitively, an economic depression. The 1890s saw an economic crisis in which most colonial banks fell over. Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania all fell victim. Western Australia's tardiness actually proved useful this time, when at this fortuitous moment their gold was discovered in an area that resembled Napoleon. Just like in Victoria's gold rush, other Australians flocked to the goldfields. The Premier in Perth so encouraged the development of this parched land that he commissioned a gargantuan 500-kilometre water pipeline to the goldfields, one of the largest engineering projects of its day. The other colonies were going through incredible hardship. A once-in-a-century drought, unions cracked by the colonial police, civil disobedience by up to 30,000 wharfies, and coal miners kicked out of work. The shithole seemed appealing after all, and it so changed the demographics of East and Western Australia that it became notable when they all wanted to unite.
Okay.
In the 1880s, for the first time since the First Fleet, the majority of people in the colonies were Australian-born Australians. A new nationalism, distinct from the weird British outpost identity, was forming. Through the 1890s, the colonies were looking for something greater. They wanted to constitute a great nation. Until recently, distance had provided a large leeway of autonomy, but thanks to the telegraph, what used to be a 3-month journey was now just a few dots and dashes.
See, this is exactly how it worked over here in the US too. Like, by the time the US declared independence, there were several generations of Americans that, you know, had never stepped foot on British soil. They didn't really identify with Britain because they've lived their entire lives over here in America. And obviously there's not as much distance between the eastern part of the US and England as there is with Australia and England, but it was still, like, there's a lot of distance there. And the US had become very autonomous in a lot of ways as well. And so we had our own national identity forming. This just happened much sooner than Australia, obviously, because I guess we were also colonized a lot sooner than Australia. But yes, very, 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 very similar stories to how, like, I guess we just declared like full independence from Britain, but Australia, I guess, didn't go that far with it. You guys did declare independence, but you guys are also still part of the Commonwealth, which is, I know that doesn't mean like you're under the rule of Great Britain or whatever, but you're still part of that system.
Australia, thanks to the Telegraph, what used to be a 3-month journey was now just a few dots and dashes. Australians didn't like the new situation. They needed to rely on each other, being all closer to each other than to Britain, but the divides between them were still hurting. Rail systems all ran on different gauges, tariffs and trade systems varied. All could benefit from federation. It would be a system to work for all, a commonwealth. The 5 eastern states, for whom things were going quite badly right now, were keen to sign up, as things could only get better. Western Australia was less keen. This was the only time in history up until this point that they were ahead of the East, and they were keen to keep their tax revenue and their new advantages. In the goldfields, however, the former Tasmanians, Victorians and New South Walians were only too happy to accept federation, even as far as threatening separation and joining as a wholly new state. Nightmare. Predictably, Western Australia was the last colony to consent to federation. New Zealand passed. By the time Western Australia had gotten its act together and actually passed a referendum for independence, it was 30 years too late, and they'd already signed the contract. There was no chance to say.
Oh, the front fell off.
Australia had already competed at cricket and rugby union against England and Britain before World War I, and in the case of the Ashes, for 35 whole years. Gallipoli didn't create the national Australian identity. It did, however, give a hard kick up the backside to the government in its own practical recognition of Australia as a nation, its responsibilities to its own people, and being the only major country of World War I to reject conscription, gave the sincere impression that Aussies were dying in a Europeans' war.
Yeah, so this is a big thing I had gotten into. Obviously, Gallipoli, I think I referenced some of this in my part 1 of this, but yeah, I've gotten into Anzac Day and Gallipoli, and a lot of you in the comments of those videos told me that Gallipoli was where a lot of you started, or Australia really started to have kind of that national identity, or it was very, very instrumental in creating a bit of that national identity, as he just said. And a lot of you told me that there was no conscription, that everybody was just volunteer, which to me is just like unbelievable that happened. So, because I feel like most other countries had conscription or some form of it at that time, so kudos to the Anzacs.
War is a Europeans' game, fought in the mud in a miserable wet Belgian winter. Sport is where Australia first defined itself in opposition to Britain. Even today, Australia is a string of far-flung settlements around a largely arid and disparate coast. It's so suited being part of the British Empire for its naval power and its enforcement of shipping lanes. Australia's foreign policy started with participation in British foreign wars for no other reason than political felchery, not conflicts that would affect them directly. That changed with World War II. When the British were pushed out of Singapore, Australia was threatened seriously with land invasion by the Japanese. Australia alone had to push back the Japanese on foot, in mud, over the mountains, across New Guinea, yard by excruciating yard. It was here in Southeast Asia they realised they were not a parochial British outpost. They were a gigantic nation on the edge of Asia, part of the Pacific.
I didn't know this either about Australia. So Japan wanted to, I guess, invade Australia. See, this is part, the South Pacific, we don't learn this part, in the US. Obviously, they just kind of like teach us about the Marines and what the US did in the South Pacific. We don't really learn about the Australian involvement at all. So I guess Japan wanted to invade Australia, and Australia had basically met them at New Guinea, which I think is a little north of Australia, isn't it? Like the northern. So they basically were defending Australia in New Guinea and fighting off the Japanese there. And I've had a lot of you in the comments tell me how Australian helped out the US Marines a lot fighting Japan, so I'm assuming that they did more than just this too. Yeah, this is just all part of like World War II that I just don't know about, you know?
Not a parochial British outpost. They were a gigantic nation on the edge of Asia, part of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Until 1949, there was never such thing as an Australian citizenship. The British still thought of Australia as a second arm. They gave over with no second word the rule of territories of Papua and New Guinea, as well as Nauru, a vast portion of their claim to Antarctica, and a dozen other minor territories. Gradually throughout the centuries, Australia founded its own foreign relations, notably with the United States, whose alliance kept those vital sea lanes open. Australia took part in Asian wars, Asian interventions, Korea, Vietnam, Borneo, Iraq, Afghanistan. Those which would not threaten Australia directly would allow it to become a force to be reckoned with, one which could ensure its citizens' prosperity, their interests overseas, their global security, and none of this was dependent on the British Empire.
Okay, so it looks like after World War II, Australia kind of turned towards the US then, and started working with us, maybe in our foreign wars, instead of, you know, the UK's or whatever. So it's part of that reason because they needed to establish kind of a dominance in the South Pacific because they were in such close proximity with Australia and a lot of these other South Pacific countries that they needed to kind of like establish their military dominance and maybe alliance with the US as well so that they could just like protect themselves and stay safe and deter some of these Asian countries from, you know, trying to harass them or whatever. So I don't know if that's the reason that they were doing all of that with the US, but I mean, it makes sense, I guess, that would be. So, I don't know, you guys enlighten me in the comments on that.
The power of Westminster, the last vestiges of possibility of intervention, was stripped as late as 1986. Although why they rejected a republic and decided to keep the monarchy is beyond me. The ties to Europe Australia had tried to maintain with its ethnic settlement policy failed to Europe.
Wait a second.
It
so
was 1986. And none of this was dependent on the British Empire. The power of Westminster, the last vestiges of possibility of intervention, was stripped as late as 1986. Although why they rejected a republic and decided to keep the monarchy is beyond me.
Yeah, that is interesting. For Australians, why did you guys decide to remain part of the Commonwealth? And I guess you guys still recognize the Queen, basically, right? The same way as Canada does. Why did you guys do that instead of not going like the full independent route like the US did? Is there some economic benefit to that? Military benefit to that? So I guess I just don't really understand why you would want to do that. But I mean, from what I've read, the Commonwealth countries have like mostly economic benefits with the UK, I guess, kind of spearheading everything. I don't know. So you guys have to explain it to me.
The ties to Europe Australia had tried to maintain with its ethnic settlement policy failed for a generation. Following the Boer War, Aboriginals who had volunteered in the British Army were refused re-entry. After World War II, when the newly Australian Australia sought growth relative to a war-torn Europe, there was a great necessity to use the land which was, until now, so sparsely populated. The economic and military security of the regional areas was paramount, to mitigate Australia becoming a vulnerable series of city-states without the ability to use its own land. Populate or perish was the motto. Assisted passage was paid for British and American and Northern European former servicemen. Then when that proved to be expensive, immigration was opened past their initial narrow fields to Greeks, Italians, Croatians. This rejection of the British and the acceptance of geographic reality was to come in the mid-century. By 1967 they first started to recognise the peoplehood of Australian Aboriginals and their human rights. During the 1970s, the Vietnam War, of which Australia was a belligerent, produced the first wave of refugees which would be settled in Australia. This was the first major arrival of Asians since the Victoria goldfields over 100 years previously. White Australia as a policy was dismantled piece by piece. Today, Australia is one of the most multicultural immigrant nations on the planet. A quarter of people were born abroad. Since the desperate thirst for convicts and the free settlers of New South Wales, then the gold rush, then the paid transportees of populate or perish, Australia has always known the value of human capital.
I feel like, again, this is something we have, you guys in Australia have in common with US, because, I mean, he basically was just stating our history to a certain extent as well over here, you know, just slightly different timeline, slightly different situation, but very similar in a lot of ways too. And I feel like the timeline of the 20th century is pretty kind of synonymous with ours over here, because obviously we had all of the racial tensions in the 60s here that were, you know, supposedly resolved by the civil rights, you know, acts and stuff like that. So I feel like, you know, a lot of that was happening at the same time in Australia with the Aboriginals, as he was saying.
The First Fleet landed with two social classes, the military and the criminal, but these are two institutions that create huge social mobility in both directions. Church and state both provided education for the common people before other countries. Egalitarian gold rushes gave everyone the opportunity to earn vast fortunes. Social programs helped the poor, and democracy gave power to the people. Australia would eventually elect a prime minister who held the world record for drinking a yard of ale. Wages, income mobility and quality of life in Australia remain, compared to the rest of the world, really high. Australia, in control of its hinterland, is a world-leading producer of almost every material imaginable. Coal, uranium, iron ore, gold, aluminium, natural gas, meat, vegetables, dairy, precious stones, and so on and so forth. Ever since refrigeration was put into ships, Australia's distance became no obstacle to export markets for things other than wool. Since the population of the country barely cracks 25 million, the domestic market for these products is minuscule, but the export market, especially in the recent Asian boom years, is massive. Wow. China, the world's leading consumer of everything from aluminium to pork, is first in the queue for Australian goods. Other richer East Asian economies, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, are low in resources and high in population and, crucially, cash rich. And then there's also India. Though mining and agriculture in raw numbers may not be the majority of the economy, they are significant, and the percent they contribute is a percentage that other countries don't have. They also provide leverage in bilateral negotiations. They employ hundreds of thousands of people. They keep the hinterlands populated, and the interested parties hold great sway in Aussie politics. The countries nearest to Australia don't have a history of war against each other, simply a history of fighting domestically. Australia must benefit from influencing the domestic policies and their openness to foreign exports. Long gone since being a major limb of the British Empire, Australia punches way above its weight, ensconced, powerful among East Asia, part of and a leader of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The balance to strike is that of the obvious environmental impact and the stupidity of human beings. Water shortages have to be dealt with often. River pollution, even this year, has killed upwards of 1 million fish. Desertification is threatening the livelihood of rural Queensland. Mining companies are quick to pollute before regulation can catch up, and the legacies in the soil of the cyanide, arsenic and mercury during the gold rush are still significant. Illegal water overuse is chronic in the cotton industry. Deforestation in Tasmania. The Great Barrier Reef is dying. Uncontrolled feral animals are causing unspoken damage to native flora and fauna. Camels, cane toads, foxes, cats, dogs, donkeys...
Well, wait a second. You guys have camels? I mean, I guess they showed them earlier. I just didn't even think about it. Like, camels I associate with the Middle East, not Australia. I didn't know you guys had camels. Huh.
Damage to native flora and fauna. Camels, cane toads, foxes, cats, dogs, donkeys, even rabbits. Australia's border force is therefore not just for people. Agriculture is both a perpetrator of and a victim of many environmental crimes. There is no developed nation whose urban life lives so close on the edge of its vast nature, so powerful from its wealth, and yet so guilty of its destruction. This country was not born Australia. From 60,000 years of Aboriginal life and home now to people from every corner of the planet, this monster of the Asia Pacific is unlike any other country on the earth. Australia has been on a great journey to come to know itself. It's now time for the rest of the world to come to know Australia.
That's why I'm doing this video. Alright, well, I feel like part 2 was a little bit more informative for me personally than part 1 was. I don't know, like there was way more information that just kind of like took me by surprise in part 2, and you know, of course I stopped the video when something came to mind, but yeah, a lot of questions to be answered, I guess, in this one. Appreciate you guys answering them down in the comments for me, especially if you're from Australia. I'd love to hear from you and just get like your firsthand knowledge about a lot of this stuff. Yeah, now I want to learn a little bit more about the history, and for some reason the geography especially is like, I'm really curious about that too. So I'm gonna have to find a video. I think what I want to do next on Australia is just like looking at the landscapes and the geography of it, because one of those last pictures they showed of like the red rock in the middle of the field or whatever, it looked very, very pretty to me, and so I just really want to like explore what Australia looks like. I enjoy learning about a lot of, like, again, the similarities. There are a lot of similarities with how the US developed to Australia, also a lot of differences, so it was really interesting just seeing some of those similarities and differences for me. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure that you like and subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Again, please answer my questions down in the comments if you are so inclined. I would appreciate it. Also, if you're interested in any of my social media, Discord, Patreon, the links to that stuff are in the description of this video and in my pinned comment, so they're pretty easy to find. Roger here with his slouch hat on. Thank you guys for watching as always. Look out for more Australia and New Zealand content. We're gonna get to you to New Zealand. We're gonna do all of that coming up here in the future, so stay tuned and we'll see you next time.